Melbourne, Peter Credland.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Let's have a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up on Credland. The first Australians evacuated from Afghanistan are on their way home as chaos continues in the capital. The Federal Education Minister is refusing to endorse a draft national curriculum unless it is substantially rewritten. Well, hallelujah to that. Alan Tudge. A grim milestone. Melbourne marks 200 days of COVID lockdown since the pandemic began, and controversy over a state Labor MP who has left Melbourne for her house in the country. New South Wales records 681 cases as regional New South Wales remains in lockdown for another week. And under 40s will join the jab rollout as the nation hits a vaccine milestone.
We agreed today, and the Cabinet also met today to affirm that we will be moving to opening up 16 to 39-year-olds for the balance of the program. We intend for that to commence on the 30th of August.
But first, with another record number of cases in New South Wales, 681, and 57 new cases in Melbourne, it's understandable the people are focused on the COVID crisis. But two aspects put it into perspective for me. The first, this is Australia. We have a first world-class health system and upwards of 20,000 public hospital beds in New South Wales alone. 681 cases might seem a lot, but they're just infections. Britain's average 29,000 infections a day shows that even with Delta, we're well below what other countries are experiencing. And of course, there's the widespread availability now of free vaccinations. As the Prime Minister was pleased to report late this afternoon, 1 in 2 Australians have had their first dose. And as hard as lockdowns are, and I know they're hard, vaccinations are the light at the end of the tunnel. And the way Australians are taking them up should give us all great hope. So that's the first aspect, puts these COVID numbers into perspective. The second is the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan. Now, as I said last night, when I showed you that image inside the US C-17 military aircraft, overwhelmingly, it was men being carried to freedom. So it's the women of Afghanistan who'll face the hardship much worse than anything like my Melbourne lockdown, as much as I might want to rail against it. Gone are the days of education and the opportunity to walk down the street or earn their own money for these women. The headscarf that was to them a liberation is gone, and the full head-to-toe cover of the burqa is back, designed to obliterate not just their presence in this new society where they're denied a voice, but obliterate their humanity as well. Never believe the lie that covering a woman head to toe is something she wants or an expression of her religious fervour. It's not. And for the women of Afghanistan and the girls too, the nightmare that now faces them, no movement outside the home, as I said, without a chaperone, all because that's the Taliban's idea of life for them under Sharia law. Women who will never again feel the sun on their faces unless it's in their own sheltered backyards, because it's supposed to offend Allah, most of all. It offends the murderous barbarians and terrorists now in charge of this country. Here is a local Afghan woman, a journalist, who took her life into her hands and covered only her head and not her face as she interviewed the Taliban spokesman live on air overnight. Not only will her face soon be seen only by those in her family and her household, there's every likelihood she will disappear from television screens altogether. Don't think this monstrous tyranny is no real concern of ours, because the last time the Taliban got to run a whole country, they turned it into a giant terrorist training camp. And the result was September 11, the atrocity in New York, 3,000 dead. Having just humbled the once mighty United States and in the process gained a treasure trove of weaponry, the Taliban and their terrorist allies will be better equipped and more confident than ever. There's even a report out of Afghanistan that several Scan Eagle drones, these are military drones, have been left behind in Joe Biden's cowardly rush to exit. Now, I doubt the Taliban would have the skills to use the drones, but they'll quickly sell them to the Iranians or the Chinese, who won't just use them, but will copy them, so that the West's advanced technology will yet again be used against us by our strategic competitors. Watching a whole country lose its freedom before our very eyes should make us better appreciate our own freedoms. And as Melbourne tonight suffers through its 200th day of lockdown, Afghanistan should teach us to demand our own freedoms back. I get it, COVID's tough, COVID's bad, but the policy to deal with COVID at the moment, it's almost worse. Every day the premiers scare us with talk of cases, all designed to justify their latest petty and oppressive restrictions. What they never do is bring in some balance by also admitting to the jobs lost and the businesses closed and the mental health pandemic, particularly with young people, and all the other diseases neglected as a direct consequence of their COVID obsession and paranoia. Now, to her credit, at least Gladys Berejiklian accepts that we'll have to live with COVID. And she is promising a release of purgatory, out of purgatory, when vaccinations reach 60% and then 70% and then 80%. A staggered release and return of freedoms. Not so Daniel Andrews. He's insisting there's got to be 0 cases as well as high vaccination rates. No freedom before then. He's even hinting at further extensions of the existing lockdown. Now, enough is enough. We have to accept the reality that COVID is here to stay. We cannot allow government to keep locking us up, supposedly, they say, for our own good. And we cannot let the fear of dying stop us from living. Let's head to Canberra now. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh has the headlines.
Sydney's COVID crisis getting worse, not better, as the state records another record day of cases. 681 new cases as the Premier calls for a rethink about the long-term COVID strategy.
We can't pretend that we're going to be 0 cases around Australia of Delta.
Preferred option is not to have COVID. I mean, I don't know why that's controversial.
What we're seeking to achieve is cases minimised as far as possible, preferably to 0, that are infectious in the community. That's what we'd like to achieve, and we have to act in accordance with that.
A spike of 52 cases in Victoria as Melburnians mark their 200th day in lockdown since the pandemic began.
Don't for a moment doubt, if there was another way, we would all choose it.
Canberra's outbreak has grown by 22.
We either stop this virus now or we live like Sydney for the rest of this year.
But the vaccine rollout also reaching a new milestone. Over half of eligible Australians have now had their first jab.
There are more people who are eligible who've had their vaccine than have not had their vaccine.
Access to Pfizer will be expanded to all under 40s from the end of the month.
Now, I want to stress, do not make a booking yet. We will advise when bookings can be made.
The unemployment rate continues to defy economist expectations, falling to its lowest level in 13 years. Dropping by 0.3% in July to sit at just 4.6%. That's despite the early impact of Sydney and Victoria's lockdowns.
Normally, when the unemployment rate hit a 12-year low, it would be a cause for celebration, but not today.
The truth is that employment went down in the month of July, with 3 million hours less being worked.
More Australians and Afghan nationals evacuated from Kabul as the Morrison government defends the pace of its rescue mission. Chaotic scenes outside the airport as the Prime Minister confirms 76 people were evacuated overnight by the British Royal Air Force.
They have been transferred to our base in Al Minhad. We have scheduled today a first flight to leave Al Minhad and come to Australia, to Perth. It has not left yet, but we anticipate that it should leave in the course of the next few hours.
Emergency visas are being issued on the ground, with Australia considering up to 5,000 humanitarian places for Afghans.
We see that as a floor, not as a ceiling, and so we believe we can achieve more than 3. And if the overall program has to be expanded to accommodate additional, then it will be.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Right, here's analysis on the latest COVID numbers in New South Wales and Victoria, as well as the ongoing evacuation out of Kabul. I'm joined from Sydney by the editor-at-large of the Australian newspaper, Mr Paul Kelly. Paul, thank you as always for your time. These bad numbers, case numbers, of course, not just hospitalisations and deaths, high case numbers, New South Wales, Victoria at 57, although encouragingly in Victoria, the vast bulk of those are in isolation. We have, though, good news on the vaccination front. Some 16 million doses have now been administered. It's 1 in 2 Australians have had at least their first dose, but still no clarity on this question. What does freedom mean? Is it 80%? Or in the case of Daniel Andrews, is it 80% vaccinations plus this nirvana of zero COVID? What's your assessment?
Well, we're going to explore this experiment with New South Wales because the Premier's made it very clear that when we get to the end of August, there's going to be some easing of restrictions, but clearly the main easing of restrictions will come at the 70% vaccination level and then later at the 80% vaccination level. But clearly the other premiers will attack Gladys Berejiklian if she makes significant restrictions at a level below 70% vaccination, and she intends to do that.
Someone said today that people in Sydney are rushing to get vaccinated. The numbers in Sydney are significant in terms of vaccinations. Someone said today, oh, they're rushing to get vaccinated because they're terrified. I'd say no. They've got some confidence in their leader that if they get vaccinated, they'll start to get freedoms back. Not so in Victoria. Those numbers aren't really moving in Victoria in terms of vaccinations because no one's sure, even if they get vaccinated, what does success look like? You know, at what point do they get freedoms back? That's the difficulty with National Cabinet. I don't think there's enough clarity for citizens right across the country.
Well, there's certainly incentive in New South Wales to get vaccinated. I think there's a very high incentive. I think this is reflected in the numbers. People are concerned about the virus, and they've got a high incentive to get vaccinated because they know that people who are vaccinated are going to be safer and they will enjoy superior exemptions to those that aren't. So incentive is very important. The motivation is there and it's present.
So why don't more people do what Gladys is doing, offering freedom at a vaccination rate rather than the folly of zero COVID?
Well, of course, each Premier will make their own decisions. And we saw what the WA Premier, Mark McGowan, said the other day. He intends to run his own operation here. And as far as he's concerned, when Perth gets to 80% vaccination, he's still prepared to lock down in the cause of zero cases. I think that is a major blunder, a major misconception. But of course, it'll be popular in the West.
All right, let's move to Afghanistan. Extraordinary 5 days, Paul Kelly. The withdrawal, horrific, chaotic scenes at the Kabul airport, an American president refusing again today to take responsibility for the botched withdrawal. Here was a former PM, John Howard, with ABC's Lee Sales last night.
On your own objectives, there's no way this mission can be viewed as anything other than a failure, is there?
I don't totally accept that. I understand the argument, but we've got to remember that since we went into Afghanistan, there is no evidence that a major terrorist attack has been orchestrated out of Afghanistan. That the great fear of the United States, of Australia and of the West after the 11th of September, that there would be other attacks orchestrated out of Afghanistan, that has not materialised. So on that criterion, the mission, whatever may be said of it, has not been a failure.
There's no doubt this is all a moment in history, but I also fear it's a bit of a turning point or a fork in the road for the West about what happens now, because I think the withdrawal, Paul Kelly, has heightened the vulnerability of the United States, not added to its strength.
Well, I think this will weaken America. It won't strengthen America. The withdrawal has been a debacle. It's been a Trump-Biden project. There's no doubt about that. But Biden bears the ultimate responsibility for the fiasco that we're now seeing. One of the fundamental questions is whether the American claim that getting out of Afghanistan will strengthen America dealing with China is going to be verified or not. I'm a skeptic about that. Time will tell.
Education Minister Alan Tudge has sent the draft curriculum back to the drawing board. I think it was cheering right around the country. I know you've written about this subject. He says it's a ideology over evidence, it's an overly negative view of Australian history and more. He's given them a barrage in a letter today, a kara, and says get back fundamental changes, not minor tweaks. He wants to see a complete rewrite. We've never spent more money on schools in this country, but we're falling behind in every international assessment. What happens next, Paul?
This should become a frontline political issue. I've looked at this draft curriculum. There are fundamental problems with it. I think Alan Tudge is doing the right thing, putting state education ministers under pressure. But of course, he doesn't have the power. He's got to try and persuade them. And in the past, they've been very, very reluctant to address properly needed curriculum reform. The maths curriculum is a fundamental problem. The language curriculum is a problem. So is the history curriculum. And at the end of the day, if the Morrison government can't persuade the states, I think it should turn this into a political issue. This is about how kids are being taught at school. And the fundamental point the minister makes is correct. The evidence is not being followed. The educationalists are putting ideology ahead of the evidence. And this is an extraordinary situation. People are not aware of it, parents are not aware of it, and they ought to be made aware of it.
Look, forget Gonski, you're absolutely right. It's about the fundamentals of what they're taught, not necessarily the money going to school coffers, because there's plenty of that, but the outcomes aren't there, and it should be frontline election issue. Paul Kelly, as always, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.
Last night, the British Parliament, the MPs convened in the House of Commons for a special debate on Afghanistan. So many of the members spoke with great passion and conviction about the plight of the Afghan people and the consequences right around the world of America's retreat. One of them, I watched a great part of last night's proceedings, was Conservative MP, former leader of the opposition in the Blair years, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
The chaotic, ghastly departure, the way that people were falling off the aircraft in their determination to get away and the helicopter shipping people out, says terrible things about the values that we hold and those who we wish to protect. So this is a shame on all of us, not just America, but also the whole of NATO and here for us in this House.
So Ian, who's an unwavering friend of Australia, joins me now live from London. Thank you for your time. I watched it last night. It was compelling viewing. I love the passion of the MPs in the Commons. I love the fact that you all speak from the heart without notes. It's something that's terrible here. That's often a dirge. I want to ask you, you've seen these pictures coming out of Kabul, as we all have over recent days. How have you felt personally watching what you see?
Well, I felt ashamed, I'll be quite frank with you, ashamed about all of us, really, America, Britain, just the whole lot of us who espouse the values of tolerance, democracy, human rights, the rule of law. And here we were, literally tumbling out of Afghanistan, being pursued by a group of people who were relatively lightly armed and who have now dismissed, you could argue, some of the world's greatest powers, particularly the world's greatest superpower. And my worry on this is, what does it say about those who we seek to protect? What will they think in future? That, you know, their word is only as good as a few weeks or months, and they could change their minds after an election. And the second bit, which really worries me, and I tried to make this point very clearly, was that here we stand at the threshold of a genuine and serious geopolitical threat. We see the advance now of those authoritarian states, Russia, China, and their acolytes. We see that they are hell-bent on growing their ideology, not just their territorial size. And what are we now seen to be doing is departing from what is actually a very strategic part of the world, because it borders Russia, close to Russia, it's close to China, it's above Pakistan, who seems to have thrown in their cards completely with the Chinese now. And, you know, you in Australia know very well what it's like to be bullied by China, who doesn't care a damn. And the most telling bit of this, which I did put in the speech, was where we spotted that the Chinese mouthpiece was now saying, look out, Taiwan, America will not be there for you, were coming. And this was re-emphasized again 24 hours later. We have to figure out what we're going to do, because very shortly we're going to be challenged on a bigger scale by China and by Russia, and we need to have a unity and a purpose.
Well, we certainly have covered the Global Times comments in relation to Taiwan here heavily in Australia. Just take me back to the withdrawal. Remarkable speech from the US President only in July, saying that none of what transpired would happen. He didn't believe it was inevitable. It was going to be orderly. It would never be like the fall of Saigon. In fact, it was eerily similar and still is. How did the West get the withdrawal so wrong?
I think the problem is this has been put, and this is where the American president made a major error. He put a political timetable as the key. Number one, why would you withdraw troops during the campaign season, during the summer? This is the time when the fights normally are at their fiercest. So why pull people out at this point? Why not wait until you get into the winter and then start doing it, where it's a little easier to control? And I'm sure the military made that point to him very clearly. They said, don't do this now, but he went ahead because he had this artificial September the 11th, 20th anniversary that he wanted to be able to stand up in front of the electorate in America and say, there, we did it. Well, I think that is shameful. The second part of it is that he blamed, I thought, which was just awful, he blamed the Afghan forces for collapsing as though they were cowards. The truth is that the Americans decided to withdraw their air cover, a significant portion of their air cover, early on. And the moment that was gone, it gave the edge away from the Afghan forces. Then they saw colleagues of theirs in other cities being executed if they fought the Taliban and were captured. So their morale sank. They hadn't been paid. The corruption in the government was too great. They hadn't been paid for weeks, often no supplies. So, this was all known to the Americans, the British, to even your intelligence services. All this was well known. And yet the American president chose to go ahead with this, and he could have ameliorated it and made it a more reasonable withdrawal. The way we withdrew is almost as important as the decision to withdraw. This was shambolic, and he must carry the can for that. And I have to say, without any sort of apology, it is shameful of him to blame everybody else. This is not what being a good leader is all about. Shoulder the blame, for God's sake.
Yeah, he has copped, and I think rightly, I agree with you, a lot of criticism around the world, even from people who would traditionally be in his camp. Go back to the point you made before about China, and you were very strong about China. And we first spoke here on the program when you were trying to convince your Prime Minister not to back in Huawei to build your 5G network. You won out in that, and thank God you did, because the world's very different than it was 2 years ago on that point. But if he is so weak in the management of the withdrawal, this is the President Biden, if he is so weak in the management of the withdrawal, then how confident are we that he can stand up to China, particularly now that China and Russia and Iran have a new terrorist state in Afghanistan at their disposal?
Yeah, this is an unanswered question, and I guess that we will see how this develops. But 2 points come out of this. The first is that we are rapidly seeing the numbers of states that you could count as part of the free world that have democracy, the rule of law. That is falling as a proportion of the overall number of states. And we are about to see, probably, should be alarming, that there is every chance that the world's biggest economic power will itself not be a democracy for the first time in modern history. Now, this really poses us a challenge. And my question really to the United States is very simple. Are they now prepared to stand by those words that I quoted from John F. Kennedy all those years ago, that they would bear any burden, pay any price to defend liberty and freedom? Now, this is the key element that has transpired all the way through this. And I have a very simple point, which is he needs to make that very, very clear and very early. We face a big challenge. And the truth is, whatever else Australia or Britain or anybody else thinks, America is both the greatest and best hope we have of securing freedom and liberty. We need to work with them. And I have criticized my government for not putting their foot down and saying to the Americans, this is ridiculous. You cannot withdraw like this at this time. We need to lengthen this out and do it at the right moment and do it in a way that reflects well on us, not badly. And I would have wished that our government had done just that. I don't think they did. I think some tried to persuade them, but I think what we should have all done is said, stop, 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 get rid of this artificial date. Let's work on what works best, not on the date.
Well, we'll see what happens from here on in, but the world would be unimaginable without a strong America, and that is the challenge, is to put steel back into their spine. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you. I really appreciate your time tonight from London.
Pleasure.
Coming up after the break, a grim milestone. Melbourne marks 200 days of COVID lockdown since the pandemic began. Controversy too over State Labor MP who's left Melbourne for a house in the country. Welcome back to Watching Credlin. Well, Labor's picking a fight with the Morrison government over climate change. In a speech to the Better Futures Forum today, opposition climate change spokesman Chris Bowen blasted the Prime Minister for not adopting a more ambitious medium-term emissions target ahead of the Glasgow Climate Summit in November. It follows an earlier statement from Bowen that a net zero by 2050 target is, quote, the bare minimum. The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor, joins me now from Goulburn in New South Wales. Minister, thank you for your time. Does the government have any intention of updating its 2030 emissions target?
Well, we update our projections every year, Peter. We've been doing that for many years, right back from when we came into government in 2013. But I tell you what we heard from Chris Bowen today, complete hypocrisy, where he said, on the one hand, there should be strong 2030 targets, but he wasn't prepared to say what Labor's would be. And, you know, the truth is, Peter, he implied, as he always does, that he would like to have a very aggressive 2030 target, just like they did at the last election. We saw what happened with that, where they wanted to halve emissions, and the only way they were going to do that was by hurting our economies, particularly hurting our industry, our agriculture. That's clearly what Bowen wants to do. Taxes are his favourite policy, but he can't bring himself to say it, so instead he just hurls abuse at others.
Do you fear he has, or Labor is reacting to what effectively has been your neutralisation of the issue of climate change going into the next election? You're talking technology, not taxes. You've got, I think, considerable support in the business community for a measured response. Labor, are they trying to pick a fight with you?
Well, I don't quite know what they're trying to do, Peter. It's actually very confusing, other than that they would really love to go back to the policies of the 2019 election. But, you know, what we've done is we've said we're not going to trade off the economy for emissions reduction. We can actually continue to reduce emissions, and we've done extremely well in Australia. We can be proud of what we've achieved, but we've done it without destroying sectors, without destroying the regions who would be the most impacted by very aggressive policies, without shutting down the mining industry or cattle, which is one of the targets of the activists. We don't need to do that. We do sensible things. And you're right, I think that's meant that many people have come on board with a sensible set of policies focused on using technology, not taxes, to reduce emissions.
I want to get your reaction to another statement today from Dr. Jonathan Pershing. He's the right-hand man to the climate czar, the US climate czar, John Kerry. He says it would really be helpful to see Australia move forward with a more ambitious effort. More ambitious, he says. What the science is telling us is the pathway needs to be more aggressive. Pretty strong words from the United States, but if you look at their record, you look at China, you look at India, why is the pressure being heaped on Australia?
Well, the critics should look at the scoreboard. The critics should look at the scoreboard, Peter, because since 2005, we've reduced our emissions by 20%. That's more than the United States. I'll repeat that, that's more than the United States. It's more than Japan, it's more than Canada, it's more than New Zealand. Both Canada and New Zealand have barely reduced their emissions, and it's certainly more than China. China has increased its emissions in the last 2 decades by 200%. It's now almost a third of global emissions. So, you know, Australia has a very, very good track record on that. We've been able to maintain critical industries like mining, like agriculture at the same time. And I think there's much others can learn about what we've been doing, which is deploying technology. Household solar, highest rate in the world in Australia, and many of your viewers tonight will have solar on their roofs. Just simple, practical things that we're doing in Australia. It's challenging, there's no doubt about that. But I think the critics should take a good look at how well we're doing and how Australia does it our way, which is delivering. We get the outcomes, and that's the Australian way.
I read some interesting statistics today. Obviously, there's a big push that we all go electric. We have electric cars, etc. We've had batteries. We've had a big battery fire, in fact, in Victoria, a very disturbing battery fire. But I read some statistics today that Afghanistan has the world's largest resources of lithium. And of course, lithium's in the batteries. It runs the whole electric world. How concerning is that?
Well, I mean, lithium is an important mineral now, and in fact, we have a lot of it here in Australia, and we're building that industry out. There's no doubt that the supply of lithium, whether it's in Australia or in other countries like Afghanistan, is going to be an enormous demand. I mean, the situation in Afghanistan obviously is very concerning right now, Peter. We're all watching very closely. I think it's tragic for our servicemen who have been over there. I think I know they're feeling that very much, and those in Afghanistan who worked alongside us. So it's a tough time, and you know, we want the Afghanistan economy to be up and running, and we want their lithium production to be up and running too. I think that would be a good outcome.
Not so much if the money's going to a terror state like the Taliban, I suspect, but that's where we are tonight. Angus Taylor, thank you for your time.
Good on you. Thanks, Pat.
All right. The rank hypocrisy of the Andrews government here in Victoria has been an almost daily display during the pandemic. It was the Andrews government that said no to the Warrnambool mum, Sky Midden, when she asked if family and friends could attend the funeral of her 8-year-old son, Cooper, after he tragically drowned on a school camp. It was the Andrews government that said no to Katrina Anderson's request to travel to Melbourne to be by her daughter's side as she battles breast cancer, even though the Sydney mother is fully vaccinated. It was the Andrews government that said no to 79-year-old Kevin Davies' request to come back to Victoria to see a cardiologist after he suffered a heart attack, forcing him quite literally to set up camp in Albury. Now it's been revealed that one of their own, Labor MP Danielle Green, whose seat is in Yan Ye and it's in Melbourne's northern suburbs, she's been living 300 kilometres away in a house in regional Victoria while on leave to care for her husband. For his reaction, I want to bring in the Shadow Finance Minister, Victorian Liberal MP, Matthew Guy. The Premier today, he was asked about why Danielle Green was allowed to leave Melbourne and Katrina Anderson wasn't allowed to come into Melbourne. Let's have a listen.
Been a well-publicised case of someone from Sydney wanting to come to Melbourne for the best of reasons. Sadly, that's not possible because Sydney poses a really significant risk. The risks we're talking about are not comparable. Like the word cancer is in both of those stories. It's tragic, but they're not comparable.
Now, we all wish Ms Green's husband all the best. Of course we do. But why is there one rule for members of the Andrews government, another rule for ordinary Victorians, Matthew Guy?
Peter, that's the question every Victorian wants to know. The Premier kept saying we're all in this together. Clearly, we're not all in this together. I mean, we've got Parliament being told we're not critical. Small business isn't apparently critical. Kids going to school isn't apparently critical. Mental health of Victorians, 6.5 million of us, that's not critical. But apparently what is critical is that government big unionised building sites keep being allowed to go ahead. So what we see is just the Premier having favourites, playing favourites, and the state government not governing for all of Victorians. I mean, we need a path out of this. After 200 days in lockdown, Melburnians want a path out of this. And when you pick stories like this, as the Premier's done, and glibly bat them away, you know, it's no wonder everyone thinks now that he is governing only for the PR and not to solve COVID.
There's a lack of clarity. 200 nights, you're absolutely right, cumulative terms. We've another 7 and we pass London, the worst in the world in terms of a state or country or city in this case locked up. The worry I think Victorians have is that we don't know what success looks like. He's not committing to releasing us at points in the target, in vaccination targets. He is saying that he's still chasing zero COVID. Well, we got to zero COVID about 4 weeks ago on the Wednesday, and by Thursday night, less than 24 hours later, we were all locked up again. So what does success look like?
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Peter. Victorians, and particularly here in Melbourne, want to know what's the end game? Well, it's very clear. The end game is what National Cabinet has agreed to, and that is when we get to 70% of vaccinations, life's got to return with restrictions back to normal, and that's what National Cabinet agreed. Now, that's got Labor leaders on it, Liberal leaders on it. They came to that agreement. Now you've got these rogue premiers and Daniel Andrews and Mark McGowan who say, actually, National Cabinet doesn't apply to me. I'll make the rules up as I go. Well, that is completely undermining the spirit of what National Cabinet's about, and more the point, what I think Australians want to see from National Cabinet. You know, in Victoria, things are very straightforward. We need to get our quarantine facilities built. They should have been built 12 months ago. We need rapid testing so that we can get on with some of our big events like the Spring Racing Carnival. We need to treat our schools as bubbles so that we don't close schools in Narre Warren when we've got a problem 70 kilometres away in Bacchus Marsh. And we need better health protocols in our hospitals. And from that, agreeing also to the National Cabinet principles, you know, we should be able to return somewhat to a more normalised life and avoid these lockdowns, which seem to be the government wants to. I mean, the Premier seems to be gleefully getting on with these lockdowns and enforcing lockdowns. There is a path out. National Cabinet has defined it. We just need premiers like Andrews and like McGowan to stick to what National Cabinet agreed to rather than going rogue and doing their own thing.
There's a $3.5 billion blowout in the Westgate Tunnel. We don't know when it will now be completed. We've got a secret report into terrible health consequences from our young people, teenagers in particular, out of lockdowns. And went out locking out parks in Victoria, if you can believe it. There was an extraordinary report in The Age over the weekend about all the Andrews loyalists have got all of these public service jobs at institutions right around Victoria. The high public service numbers, that they were formerly political advisors in his personal office. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it was damning reading. His own office, 87 employees. I worked for a Prime Minister. He had a whole country to run. He only had 50-odd people on his books. This is a police state. This is an extraordinary state here in Victoria. What's your reaction, Matt Guy, to where we are right now as a supposedly transparent democracy?
Peter, I've long said this. Unless you're here in Victoria, and particularly in Melbourne, it is hard to fathom the extent of the politicisation of government and every structure that relies on government here in Melbourne. And it doesn't just extend to government. It goes to industry groups. It goes to big sporting groups, that they are all rolled up in this, the language of the state government, in the language, frankly, of the Premier, because this government is a one-man band. It's been a one-man band from day one. It remains a one-man band during COVID. I mean, I still am yet to see I stand with Mark McGowan or I stand with Andrew Barr. There's only I stand with Dan, because it's all team. It's all part of the PR and the spin. This government in Victoria is just one great big PR machine. It doesn't produce successful results economically. Its infrastructure projects are all over budget. They are all late. It has literally ripped the guts out of the health and education systems while claiming the opposite. But it's all about the PR, and that's all they're interested in.
Matthew Guy, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.
Still to come, why the return of the Taliban is a disaster for Afghan women and girls. A whole lot more. International panel after the break. Welcome back to watching Credline. Well, make no mistake, the return of the Taliban is a disaster for Afghan women and girls. Earlier this week, one of the Taliban's top spokesmen confirmed women would be subject to a strict interpretation of Sharia law, which previously saw girls banned from going to school, women stoned for adultery or so-called immodesty crimes, and rape victims put behind bars. According to reports from on the ground, women and girls have largely disappeared from the streets of Kabul. You can't blame them. To discuss this and more, I'm bringing in my international panel from Sydney, co-host of Outsiders, James Morrow, and from Adelaide, host of Bernardi, the man himself, Corey Bernardi, Apologies, gents. I'm all over the shop. It's a tight end of the week. It's been pretty savage to see what's been happening on the ground in Kabul. It's heartbreaking, actually, Corey. I mean, you and I go back a long time in Canberra. We've been along this Afghan road for a long time. I think it was entirely foreseeable, but just an appalling handling of the withdrawal and the way in which now this brutality will be revisited on these women.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, Peter. We lament it because a lot of our forces did so many good things over there in trying to liberate people from this oppression. And, you know, the bumbling of the Biden administration and others have left them captured by these barbarians again. This is sort of medieval barbarity that they're going to experience. We've already seen reports today of a woman who was shot because she had didn't have a burqa on. She only wore the hijab, and so that was immodesty. We know that the Taliban will put on a PR face, but as they gain more and more control, they will slip back into the sorts of tyrannical stuff that you mentioned before. And the fact that the Chinese are giving them diplomatic status, and even a US general, I think today, was forced to almost concede that they have to open diplomatic discussions with them to get Americans out, is a tragedy for the West, I've got to say, Peter.
President Biden gave an extraordinary performance in his interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos. Let's have a look.
When you saw the significant collapse of the Afghan troops we had trained, up to 300,000 of them, just leaving their equipment and taking off, that was, you know, that's what happened. That's simply what happened.
But we've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this.
He's embarrassing, James.
It's just shocking, Peter. There's no words to express how disgraceful that interview was. I mean, for him to say it was 4 days ago, 5 days ago, well, it was actually 2 days ago when he gave the interview. But putting that aside, that just goes to show not only, you know, that there are serious questions about Joe Biden's capability to do the job, but also about his extreme callousness. And we know from interviews with people like Richard Holbrooke from when Joe Biden was vice president under the Obama administration that he had a real thing about Afghanistan, and he did not care at all about abandoning the Afghan people as he has done. Of course, abandoned, you know, so many Americans and so many allies as well. I'm told that, you know, there's some push on in Washington to see if Kamala Harris could step up and take over. But the problem is that she's the deciding vote in the Senate as president of the Senate, which they've got 50-50. And she's also not very well liked among Democrats as well. So the Democrats are in a terrible position right now. They've got this leader who is callous and, frankly, I don't think with it. They've got no succession plan if anything happens. And so where does that leave America? Where does that leave the world? Not in a very good place.
And of course, Corey, the Chinese Navy, they've conducted a live fire exercise in the waters south of Taiwan. This is warships, anti-submarine aircraft. This is the next sort of battleground.
Yeah, you'd think it is. I mean, Sky News' own experts in this field, Catherine McGregor and others, have said that a hot war is likely in over Taiwan. And why wouldn't you if you're China? Because the Americans have been deemed impotent by this impotent president, and their weakness, we know that they've been compromised, the family's been compromised by deals with China, and Joe Biden just doesn't seem up to the task. So if America is not capable of standing up for freedom around the world, I think we're going to find that that more tyrannical, more dictatorships are going to arise, and they're going to assume a very strong position. And that fills me with dread, as it should fill every freedom lover right around the country and the world.
Yeah, and all the while here, we've got a whole lot of premiers with vaccines on the table who are scrapping and moaning and can't agree how we get out of lockdowns. It's extraordinary. Corey Bernardi, James Morrow, thank you for your time. All right. The events industry around Australia, live theatre, all of that as well, on the brink after the break. Fed up With dealing with distraught brides and cancellations, not once but multiple times, one Melbourne business has come up with an idea as a way to help them walk down the aisle in these times of considerable event uncertainty. But now even that bold idea has struck difficulty, with the Andrews government cancelling all weddings except for end of life or deportation reasons. The owner of Whitestone Events, Stephanie Reid, joins me now from Melbourne. Thank you for your time, Stephanie. You came up with this idea of helping brides elope. Now, eloping is a big deal. I know many of them want a big day. Why did you go down the path of this idea?
Look, we're basically just trying to create a concept that is restriction friendly. We've brought together a few really tight-knit suppliers. So obviously a beautifully decorated venue in Whitestone, a caterer, a celebrant, photographer, and basically tried to create a package that's very restriction friendly with a maximum of 20 guests allowed at the wedding. Mm-hmm. In the case of a lockdown springing up last minute, couples can easily make one phone call and postpone the event at the drop of a hat. So we're basically just trying to create something that's really beautiful, inexpensive, fuss-free. And, you know, some people are over all the postponements. They just want to get married. They want to get on with their lives. They're sick of, you know, constantly postponing and all the sort of anxiety that goes along with that. And we're just trying to make things really easy for people in creating this elopement package.
Yeah, it was only just before we went into this current lockdown, I overheard a conversation of someone about to go to a friend's wedding on the weekend. This was the third attempt they had at getting married. Obviously that didn't happen because the lockdown came in the very next day. How many times have you seen brides have to move these their weddings, and what sort of cost is involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's been absolutely heartbreaking. I sort of run two small event businesses between Melbourne Event Florals and, of course, the venue Whitestone, and I think I would have seen close to 100 events that have needed to be postponed. It's been absolutely devastating and heartbreaking for these couples that, you know, they just want to get married. You know, it's distressing listening to their stories, let alone actually being in their shoes. Everyone's just had enough. You know, some couples have had to postpone 7 or 8 times. The whole process of planning a wedding is supposed to be exciting, enjoyable, and, you know, it's just turned into a really distressing, anxiety-ridden experience for these poor brides. And at the end of the day, we just don't know when it's going to end. There's very little light at the end of the tunnel at the moment. As you mentioned, events aren't allowed to go ahead at the moment. So from a business perspective, we're not taking, you know, final payments from couples, or, you know, no one has the confidence in the current climate to want to book future events. So it's incredibly sad. And yeah, as a small business owner, it's horrible for everyone involved. You know, government subsidies have been few and far between, very minimal. I think since JobKeeper finished up, and that was some time ago, there's been next to no government support, which we desperately need at this time. You know, it's incredibly sad. It's incredibly difficult. Everything I've ever worked towards, you know, we're just completely ignored, and we're in despair. We don't know what to do from here. You know, I think people look at a career in the events industry now as being completely unstable. You can't support a mortgage. You can't continue to, you know, reliably put food on the table week after week in the current climate, and it's just horrible.
It's pretty grim, Stephanie. I wish you all the best. Let's hope we get out of this lockdown sooner rather than later. Vaccinations, I think, is our only way out, not the government. It's Victorians, Australians taking it upon themselves to get out of lockdowns. Thank you for your time.
Completely agree. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Well, former Army officer Tom Tugendhat was on the show earlier this week, and he gave a superb speech last night in the House of Commons. Have a listen.
I've watched good men go into the earth, taking with them a part of me and a part of all of us. And this week has torn open some of those wounds. It is the image of a man whose name I never knew, carrying a child who had died hours earlier, carrying this child into our firebase and begging for help. Now, there was nothing we could do. it was over. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is what defeat looks like. It's when you no longer have the choice as to how to help. This doesn't need to be defeat, but at the moment, it damn well feels like it.
I'm going to put that speech up on my Facebook page. It's only about 7 minutes. It is compelling. He served in Afghanistan and he's one of the best British MPs you will find. I'm not with you tomorrow night. Night off. Back on Monday night at 6. Andrew Bolt's next.